Hello, welcome to the ICC Annual Conference. We are now on day 3 of 3. We're on our penultimate session, webinar 6. Thank you for all those that have been attending and joining in on all of the sessions. If you have missed any, don't worry, you can log on to your Swapcard account, go to the event, and all of the sessions are available on demand to watch at any point. They'll be available for the next 10 working days, so please do watch them if you've missed any. I just should point out that the live discussion is open. We will be asking the audience to participate and have several polls ready to go. So please do watch the live discussion for updates. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Guy Pendle, who is partner at CMS and also vice chair of our ICC Arbitration and ADR committee here in the UK. Guy, welcome.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are. It's my pleasure to moderate this session, which is, as Natalie said, the penultimate session of the week. So if you're still tuned in and going through this, well done on your perseverance. It will be worth the wait, I can assure you. Today's session, or this session, is called Singapore as the Preferred Seat, a Blip or an Unstoppable Force, and how should young practitioners view the trend? Now, the first thing I'm going to do is introduce our panelists, and we'll come on to a series of questions that we have asked each of the panelists to address. And I'll introduce them not in the order that they come up on the slide, but the order in which I will be asking them to come up. But I'm going to introduce them all first. Then I'll say a few words about the subject, and then we'll get straight into the discussion. Please, can I invite you all to pose questions in the question section, or by all means add comments in the chat as we go. In the modern age, I don't need to introduce people because you can find their bios online. So I've challenged all of my speakers today to tell me something that you wouldn't be able to find out about them online. So I can tell you now that among our speakers, we have an artistic gymnast, a baker, a rower, a cox, but not in the same boat as the rower, and a musician. And if you're wondering who's who, don't worry, I'm going to put you out of your misery now. So in the order of which I will be asking our speakers to present, we have Abraham Vergis SC, who is the Managing Director of Providence Law LLC. He is our musician. He plays in a rock band in Singapore and has been a regular Law Rocks performer, so look out for him at the next one. After Abraham, if I got the order right, we have Sui Yen Ko. Sui Yen Ko is a partner at the Wong Partnership. I don't know how much artistic gymnastics she does now, but it was certainly something she did in the past. After Sui Yen, we have Jalita Panjaitan. Jalita is a partner and the Asia head of dispute resolution at Linklaters, based in Singapore. Now, Jalita holds the record for the fastest circumnavigation of Hong Kong in a coastal rowing boat in a 4-man scull. So you've probably worked out by now that Jalita was the cox. We then have, make sure I get this right, we then have Darius Chan, who follows Jalita. Darius is at Fountain Court Chambers and at Breakpoint LLC. He is the avid rower who used to get up at 5:30 a.m. every 3 days a week when he was at university in New York. And to follow that up, we have our baker, Philippa Charles, who tells me she bakes a mean meringue. I don't know whether that means it's good or whether it's just mean. And Philippa is a partner and the head of international arbitration at Stewart's. So let's come on to the topic and a few words of introduction from me. And I think you probably all know arbitration is now big business, and the seat of arbitration, along with the applicable law, is often, if not always, often but not always, will influence a party's choice of both counsel and arbitrator. And since counsel and arbitrator generally like to get paid for their work, It means that the venues that can attract international arbitration are attracting revenues into their jurisdictions. So it comes as no surprise that many countries are now competing to make their cities attractive choices for international arbitration. But I think that's just the tip of the iceberg, because international arbitration is part of that whole system of judicial dispute resolution. And the countries that can establish themselves as having or being perceived to have a stable, reliable legal system underpinned by a rule of law are more likely to be popular choices for legal services generally. So having a stable and strong international arbitration system makes a much wider contribution. Now, I probably don't need to tell you that London has historically been a very popular choice for international arbitration. And for a lot of us practicing in London, we value that greatly, but we may well also have come across from time to time practitioners who may be quite complacent about London's position in the world for international arbitration and might think that London's position is secure and there's nothing that we can do about that. Now, that might be true in the short term, but actually this is where I think it is important to look to Singapore, because Singapore has achieved something remarkable in the last 3 decades, so in 30 years, putting itself firmly on the map as a destination of choice for arbitration. The reason I say 30 years is because it's 30 years since the Singapore International Arbitration Centre was formed. Contrast that, when the Singapore Arbitration Centre was formed, so back in 1991, the LCIA was already 100 years old. So here we are now, another institution, ICC, and for ICC UK, this is a great opportunity for us to hear from these arbitration experts, all but one, based in Singapore, Philippa based in London. I think this is an opportunity actually for London practitioners to see what we can learn from Singapore, but also what Singapore can learn from London. Now, if we can move to the next slide, just to put this into perspective, these are the stats from the latest 3 reports from the Queen Mary University International Arbitration Survey. And what you can see, London has done pretty well in all of the last 3, but we see a very solid rise for Singapore, coming from 4th up to joint 1st place this year. Now, if we move to the next slide, one always has to be careful about statistics, because what we see is the demographics of those surveyed has changed, and we've seen a significant increase in respondents from Singapore in 2021 and fewer in other jurisdictions, and in particular a drop in those from Europe, which may indicate some of those changes. But that also does not necessarily reflect everything, because even in 2018, when Singapore was on the rise, the number of respondents from Asia was still low. If we move on to the next slide, what we see here, these are the Icc statistics. So these are based on the actual selections of seat in Icc arbitrations from 2015 to 2019. The 2020 stats, although Alexi Moore did speak about them on Wednesday, they've not formally been published, so we haven't included them. And what you see here is a slightly different picture, but I can tell you that the rankings that we see in 2019 are going to change in 2020, but this would still put London and Paris pretty high for ICC, and with Singapore actually more stable at around 30 seats chosen each year. But again, watch out for the 2020 figures. So that's just a little bit of background for you. In order to make this interactive, we're also going to run some polls. Now we can move on to the next slide. So we've got 3 questions for you. They will be coming up live very shortly in Swapcard, and you should be able to get to that from the live discussion. There's a polls tab, and there are 3 questions. So the first is, were you surprised that Singapore was named alongside London as the joint most preferred arbitral seat? That was the results of the latest Queen Mary survey. Next question, if we can move on to the next slide. What is the most popular arbitral seat amongst your clients apart from London? Now, some of you may not feel you can speak for your clients, so if you can't respond in terms of what your client's view might be, think about this in terms of, if you weren't recommending London, which seat would you be recommending? And then the third question, what factor do you or your clients consider to be the most important when choosing an arbitral seat? So we've got those polls running. They will be live throughout the chat, and we will come to those in a moment. I also need to thank at this point Lexi Menish, a Senior Associate at Freshfields in Singapore, for pulling together the statistics that I have already presented. So thank you, Lexi. And then final point, I've encouraged all of our panelists to be provocative and challenging. I have no doubt they will be. So this is going to be a very interesting debate, but let me just drop in a caveat on behalf of all of us. The views, therefore, you're about to hear may not necessarily be our own, and certainly or most certainly will not necessarily consistently represent the views of our respective firms or chambers. So with that caveat, I'm going to move straight on to our first speaker, Abraham. So Abraham, you're going to speak on the rise of Singapore as a preferred seat and the reasons and factors for its success. So Abraham, over to you.
Thanks, Guy. Good morning to everyone who's tuning in from London. As I was mentioning just now, it's already beer o'clock here out in Singapore. So for those who are watching out from Singapore, just an hour to go. Right, now I'm going to talk about the factors that has led to the rise of Singapore as an international arbitration seat. Guy mentioned just now that the SIAC was established in 1991. And that's significant because that makes whatever Singapore has achieved that much more remarkable, because it's really a 30-year runway that we are speaking of. The other statistic that may be of interest to participants is to know that the International Arbitration Act in Singapore was only enacted in 1995, 4 years after that. So that really gives you a sense that we were really in our infancy in the 90s, late 90s when I started practice. And to see how far Singapore has come in those 30 years is indeed very remarkable. Now, I think if you ask any Singaporean, they'll tell you nothing happens by accident in Singapore. Whatever you see as the outcome of our growth in the arbitration sector, you can take it that it was all part of a very carefully planned and executed initiative on the part of various stakeholders in Singapore. Now, when we come to discussing what are the reasons that has given rise to this meteoric success that Singapore is enjoying right now, I bring it down to maybe 3 or 4 key points. First of which is that Singapore adopts a whole of government approach. A whole of government approach, meaning we are able to bring together all the various stakeholders into a united front, and everyone is sort of marching to the same beat, moving to the same tune. And so in Singapore context, what this means is we had a vision in the 90s that arbitration was a key missing piece in our international services offering. As you know, Singapore is developing itself as an international financial center, and it has always seen the rule of law and its place as an international dispute resolution center as pivotal to realizing the overall goals for Singapore. So what you see is the legislature coming together to come up with statutes and laws that promote arbitration. Our law minister, K. Shanmugam, says that in Singapore, when we see a problem, we solve it legislatively within 3 to 6 months. And so we can see how we've created rules to expand the role of arbitration and to promote it. We also have a very supportive judiciary that has helped to keep Singapore firmly pro-arbitration. We even have created a Singapore International Commercial Court, which on one sense could be seen to be a competition to international arbitration, but in Singapore, we see the International Commercial Court as providing a supplementary or complementary role to the development of international arbitration by providing for this additional international offering. We have the Economic Development Board of Singapore actively supporting the arbitration initiatives. You may have heard of Maxwell Chambers, which provides solid infrastructure supporting arbitrations. But you also have other less obvious incentives, for example, tax concessions for arbitrators who are practicing out in Singapore. Now, in the 1 minute that I have left, I would say the other factor that's been key to Singapore's success is how we've been able to internationalize the legal sector. And in particular, I would highlight the fact that we've been extremely good at drawing in the superstars of the arbitration world to come in and join our initiative, either as a member of the board of the SIAC or as a member of the Court of Arbitration. We've managed to pull in strong international judges to helm the SICC. All of this, what it does is it creates so many advocates for Singapore, whether it's Singapore law or Singapore arbitrations or Singapore judicial system. And each and every one of these international superstars are going out there promoting the cause of Singapore. So these, to me, in 5 minutes, Guy, are the key reasons which I think has helped Singapore develop itself as a key center for arbitration.
Thanks, Abraham. And I'm going to throw out a couple of questions, and I'm going to invite any of the panel to jump in and respond. But they also know that I'll pick on them if they don't jump in. So my first question is this, and actually probably directed to all of you based in Singapore, who I suspect are probably conducting maybe a majority of your arbitrations that are seated in Singapore. And my question is, how many of those arbitrations are conducted in a language other than English?
I have to say, based on my experience, all the arbitrations in Singapore have been conducted in English. So I've done some in Chinese, but that's only in a Chinese seated arbitration under the CTEC rules.
Just English for me as well.
And I thought that would be the case. And in a way, I think that's an important commonality. And of course, one should not forget that we actually, as Swee Yen pointed out, we've got lots of arbitrations conducted around the world in languages other than English, but it's actually, it seems to me, a common point, and probably one that, and I'll be interested in what people's view will be in the chat, but that actually where you have international transactions very often conducted under English law, does that actually make, funny enough, Singapore and London natural choices, actually not to do with necessarily legal systems or even the applicable law, but purely the choice of language. So I'm interested in views on that, but I've also got another specific question in relation to law change in Singapore and Abraham's comment, sorry, not Darius's comment, Abraham's comment that law can get changed very quickly in Singapore. And there's a question here, which is that always a good thing? And I'm speaking from a jurisdiction where that doesn't happen as quickly. We're still on an Arbitration Act 1996, which is good. There isn't universal support for all aspects of it, but nor is there consensus as to how it should change. Does that run the risk that actually Singapore might take a more populist route for international arbitration? And is that necessarily a good thing?
I would like to chime in on that. In fact, I think the fact that the law changes quickly is an extremely good thing, because the aspects of the law which actually changes is a process that goes through several months and goes through a public consultation process. So for instance, a very key example of how the swiftness of the legislature really made the difference was when Hong Kong first started talking about third-party funding. So Hong Kong started the conversation a long time ago. And in Singapore, we still had the doctrine of champerty regarded as illegal. The moment Hong Kong started speaking about it, we passed and we changed our legislation to facilitate it way ahead of Hong Kong. And I think that was very significant. And why do I say that it is a swift change, but it is a considered change? In the most recent changes to the International Arbitration Act, we had a public consultation where we had 4 changes, and not all of those changes were actually adopted in the final act. So one of the changes was whether we should allow appeal on a question of law on an opt-in basis. And after public consultation, the ministry decided we're not going to make that amendment at this juncture. So I think the swiftness of it is a good thing because it's a considered decision.
And it's an interesting example because obviously that last one is one of the possible points of controversy for some in England and Wales, where we have effectively, you can exclude that right of appeal, but you can choose to include it by either not excluding it or possibly even opting in. And I don't think there is even a settled view on that, but it's a difficult one because if you look at London, for example, there's a very significant insurance arbitration and maritime arbitration industry. They really value, and in fact, they've always been troubled by the potential shortage of cases on issues that go to arbitration in the absence of that point of appeal. So that's a good point. Maybe we'll come back to that, and I'll see if we've got comments coming through in the chat. Let's move on to the next topic, and Swee Yen, you're going to deal with this, and that is, does Singapore have what it takes to maintain its ranking amid fierce competition from seats around the world, and can Singapore surpass London as the undisputed preferred seat in the world? Something tells me this is a little bit of a leading question for you, but
wait till I get my pom-poms out. I just go for you.
I love leading questions, and I'll answer it unhesitatingly with a yes. So let me explain. In the course of giving my comments, I've already spoke about the constantly evolving and forward-looking arbitration framework in the sense of the legislation. So the Ministry of Law is always looking at, the arbitration and the international arbitration market and seeing what is good for changes, and they are able to effect that swiftly. The second reason why I say yes is because of the pro-arbitration environment that Abraham earlier spoke of. And he says it's a whole of government approach. And I echo that. And I think what is most critical in this government approach, when we look at the legislature, the executive, as well as the judiciary plays the largest role in cementing Singapore's popularity as a seat. And the reason why I say that is because the Singapore courts adopt a pro-arbitral stance, and they adopt this principle of minimal curial intervention. So you see many cases where you have challenges based on breaches of due process, but the courts have often refused them because they said that ultimately you must respect a tribunal's case management powers. But that is not to say then that you do not read instances also of the court stepping in, where they feel that there is actually a breach of natural justice, where they feel that something has gone wrong, whether the tribunal has acted ultra petita, infra petita, the courts have been very ready to step in. And I think this speaks very well of a pro-arbitration system, because it doesn't mean that if you're pro-arbitration, awards should not get assigned. I think precisely because you're pro-arbitration, you must ensure that the due process in arbitration is respected. So you must be ready to step in. And I think the Singapore courts have been very robust in that. Abraham also mentioned the SICC, and he said that it was a complementary to arbitration, which I agree. But what also made it very interesting to me and gave me some concern about whether it would affect Singapore's popularity as a seat was when the legislature passed the the Supreme Court Judicature Amendment Act. And they said that setting aside cases can also be heard by the SICC. And the reason why it gave me a bit of a concern is because if you look at the SICC panels, many of them also practice as arbitrators, and they take on arbitrator appointments. Then the immediate question to me when that happened was that for parties who are choosing Singapore as a seat, would they now tell their clients don't, because it'll be arbitrators deciding on arbitrators, and it takes away the very premise of a supervisory court where the judges are constitutionally, entrenched. But I have to say my concerns are probably overstated, because Recently, I've been reading a couple of decisions, and most recently from the Court of Appeal on an SICC decision relating to arbitration. And they were very robust, and they did set aside the partial award because they felt that that particular dispute didn't fall within the ICC terms of reference. So I think it's a good space to watch. The third reason, and Abraham also touched on it, is the success of the various institutions. I think SIAC's success cannot be understated. They have record numbers, and more critically, you may not know this, but the SIAC model arbitration clause used to put Singapore as the seat. So before they had the square brackets where you could actually, where they internationalized SIAC to say that you could have SIAC rules even if you're arbitrating in New York or London, but they used to have Singapore as a seat. And I went to trace back, and that was only, I think, taken away sometime in 2016, but now Singapore still appears in the model clause in the square brackets. So I think that also has a certain impact and has helped parties when they incorporate the model clause to just put Singapore as a seat. So I think that makes a huge difference. And of course, ICC, PCA, all of them have set up their offices in Singapore, and they have an increasing number of cases. The fourth thing, which I want to say why Singapore would surpass London, is pure economics. There is a shift of economic power to Asia. When we look at the number of Asian disputes, when we look at the number of parties who are involved in disputes on the SIAC statistics just by themselves, you can see that there are many Asian parties who are increasingly being involved in arbitration, not just commercial arbitration, but investment arbitrations. And what is also an interesting phenomenon is that there are an increasing number of investment arbitrations seated in Singapore with absolutely nothing to do with Singapore. I think all the investment arbitration cases that have come before the Singapore courts have been that. And I do want to touch on one last point, which may sound pretty controversial to Guy and Philippa, but I do believe that Brexit would have a certain impact on London as a seat for international arbitration. While there have been many writings saying that it is a plus because now London would be ready to grant anti-suit injunctions in favor of arbitration, I think one cannot forget that it is not so much of Brexit and people moving from London to Singapore, but Brexit, people moving from London to Paris. I think it is that general sense of European parties, whether they would have a certain subconsciously negative sense because of this Brexit, that they then decide instead of London, I think I'm going to go to Paris. And that is what I see may possibly affect London. I think I have to stop. And, you know, I want to debate more with my other panelists.
Well, thank you, Sui. I think let's pick up that last point first. And I think it's probably only right that I give Philippa the opportunity to respond to that. And I think Sui raises 2 points here. And actually, it might be worth picking them up. There's probably the sort of more of the legal question as to whether Brexit actually impacts on arbitration. But then I think there's the other point, which is, does it impact on a perception that could therefore influence choice? So maybe you want to pick both, take both of those points, Philippa.
Sure. No, and I don't disagree with Sui completely in the sense that I think Brexit clearly has an impact on how people perceive London as a seat for arbitration. But actually, I think what we're hearing more and more, and particularly from the commercial court in terms of its support for arbitration proceedings in London, is that freed from some of the restraints that existed, including anti-suit injunctions within Europe, you know, it may become a more attractive choice for certain parties. And I think you know, it's something I'll probably talk about a bit more later in terms of kind of supportive court structures and how important those are to the maintenance of a successful standing as a seat. But yes, I mean, look, perception is a problem. From a practical perspective, I suspect there's going to be very limited impact in the short term. I think, you know, the importance of English law, the importance of the common law is there. The depth of practitioners in London, you know, it is undeniable, and they're not moving away. You know, the practitioners are still here. And, you know, and there are other aspects which I think, you know, still will continue to promote London as a safe and secure seat. And I think there's also, you know, a particularly interesting dynamic from the legal perspective in terms of especially intra-EU bilateral investment treaty cases. And it's a very specific issue, but the reality is that you may have a situation in which the English courts are going to be asked to consider whether or not they are still bound by ACMEA so far as concerns the enforcement of awards made in intra-EU BIT cases. And that is a situation where the English court potentially has the opportunity to depart from that prior jurisprudence. Now, whether it will or not is a whole other question, and we haven't had a case on it yet. But that to me is the thing that is potentially very interesting and could be a future selling point potentially for parties to come to London in preference to any other European seat.
Thanks, Philippa. In the traditional way, I think Sui Yen wants a right of reply to that. So I'm going to give Sui Yen 30 seconds just to respond, but then I actually do want to move on to the next topic because we've also got some questions coming in from the audience, and we should probably pick up those. So Sui Yen, 30-second reply.
Thank you. Do you think the fact that there's this negative sense and perception, and England and London being traditionally a common law jurisdiction as compared to a lot of the European countries being civil law, would therefore shift it towards Paris? I think that is what I would be happy to hear.
Well, I think we should debate that at the end, because I think that raises an interesting question of choices of common law versus civil law systems, which was actually a question I put to Alexi Moore on Wednesday. But so we'll save that. Next, we come to Jalita. And Jalita, you are going to talk about the implications of Singapore and Hong Kong, also another seat gaining popularity around the world, as preferred seats for business or businesses, but also for law firms and lawyers in general. So that goes back to that point I raised in the beginning, that actually arbitration isn't just about arbitration, but it's actually about creating a more attractive environment for business.
I think that's right, Guy. Certainly, if we think about what are the consistent themes in the rise of Singapore and Hong Kong together as popular seats globally, and obviously particularly in Asia, I think it probably reflects a combination of, first, the shifting center of gravity of world economic activity that both Sui Yen and Abraham have already mentioned before me, and the combination of that with, as you say, the sort of arbitration ecosystem in those seats, including the reputation of these seats for active, experienced and reliable arbitral institutions, independent judiciary, as we've mentioned already as well, that's supportive of arbitration. If we end up coming back to that topic, I think for me, the theme there is really party autonomy as opposed to just curial non-intervention. And then the robust legal and commercial infrastructure to support the conduct of arbitral proceedings. And that's things like, getting in and out of the city, coming in and out with or without relevant qualifications, and then, all the way through to, I think, support for third-party funding of arbitration as well. I feel like we're on an extremely long advertisement for Asian seats, but we're allowed to do that when we're visiting a London conference, I guess, from Asia. I think the obvious implication for business would be that they can and should continue, increasingly even, to look to Hong Kong and Singapore as reliable neutral seats for arbitration as their economic activity increases in the region. So I suppose the appropriate question then to ask is there any reason to think otherwise? And we should at least be a little bit self-examinating on these points. So the first question, there's two parts to that for me. The first is, are there any other seats that are equally attractive? I think there are institutions in other main economic centres across Asia that are seeking to develop their reputation, maybe their rules, and also the supportive legal and sort of travel regimes I mentioned. But I think probably all of us would agree that within Asia, there are presently probably no other seats that have the same level, particularly of institutional standing and institutional concentration. Obviously, the ICC has made its choices as well in that context so far. And then also, I think the transparency and independence of the judicial process remains unrivaled in Hong Kong and Singapore as against other seats around the region. And also, it's interesting to note that outside of Asia, in between 2018 and the 2021 Queen Mary surveys, we saw respondents from Europe and Africa, increase in their preference towards Singapore, at least, from the 4th to the 3rd most popular amongst those respondents. So as you said, Guy, whilst there may be some reflection going on here to do with more Asian respondents to the survey, it's not, it doesn't suggest necessarily that others are not preferring Singapore more and more as time goes on. I think what we'll have to see there is whether travel restrictions, because of course it's one thing in the past to say that we've had very open ports and that may not be the future, but whether those restrictions, or perhaps alternatively the importance of having almost longitudinal overlapping time zones if we're going to stay on the virtual arbitration front, will affect the popularity of Singapore at all, because we tend to go sideways to Singapore rather than up and down perhaps from other parts of the world. The second element I was going to mention there is just the impact of China. You did ask us to be controversial. So economically, I think it's clear that the impact of China's economic growth is likely to boost the number of transactions and therefore disputes going on in the Asian region. Politically, I think there is a question about whether the influence of China will begin to undermine the perceived independence of Hong Kong. I'm not going to presume to make any predictions about that on this session, but the one observation I wanted to make in that context is that any potential adverse impact on the political side might well be fully mitigated, or at least significantly mitigated, by the increasing legal integration between the mainland and Hong Kong. As many of your audience will know, Hong Kong's seated arbitrations have the advantage both of cross-border enforcement of arbitral award arrangements between the mainland and Hong Kong, as well as the access to PRC courts for cross-border granting of interim relief measures to support Hong Kong seated arbitrations in respect of assets in the PRC. And our firm was, one of the early successful users alongside others of that scheme, which has only been introduced as recently as 2019. HKISC produced some statistics about 1 year in, and it looks to be very successful, as we found as well. And the rates perhaps are even as high as 90% of cases that apply for an order from a PRC court for preservation of assets in the PRC for a Hong Kong seated arbitration are successful in getting that order, which I think is a pretty significant advantage, actually, given how difficult enforcement can be in the PRC and how sometimes lacking in transparency, just kind of asset ownership and things can be in China. But Singapore also benefits from Chinese economic growth, and every year since 2010, Chinese parties have been amongst the top 5 users of the SIAC, with an increasing number of cases from Chinese parties year on year. The question, just last point from me, question does request some comment on the implications for law firms and lawyers. I think there is an increasing importance for being able to access the local courts in Hong Kong and Singapore, so in terms of where law firms have offices and available lawyers with local admission, as well as being able to speak local and near country languages. So you asked a question before about conducting arbitrations other than in English. More than 50% of the arbitrations I've been involved in have included Indonesian testimony, whether or not full conduct of the proceedings in the foreign language. And so I think Mandarin and Bahasa are 2 languages that practitioners could certainly focus on making sure they've got in their arsenal, one of them in their arsenal, as they progress in Asia. And then I think the last point from me is that one of the ironies of the popularity of Hong Kong and Singapore is that they are relatively transparent, stable, and independent for adjudication as compared with all of the other countries around them in Asia. And that means that the challenge in many of the cases that are determined in Hong Kong and Singapore is actually to enforce your award or deal with the getting your results given effect in the country where the relevant assets or the project or the counterparty are located. And so I think a growing trend will be an increased focus by clients on the track record of law firms, not just in conducting arbitral proceedings, but then in executing on the practical, like interim protective measures, combating typical attempts to frustrate the foreign party in the local jurisdiction, and then obviously the enforcement of arbitral awards as well.
Thanks very much, Julita. And now is, I think, the right time to introduce our first question from the audience. And I emphasize that this is an audience question and not a question that I have posed, but I'm going to read it out, and I suspect Philippa will be happy not to answer this, but I'll leave it to any of you to field this one. I think you've seen it as well. Doesn't Singapore's authoritarian government and system make it far less attractive than alternatives such as London or Paris? Isn't Singapore better as a centre for arbitration for companies in authoritarian or totalitarian countries?
we're going to have to contest the fundamental premise first, aren't we? Let's start there. But so, I mean, I don't think I would accept that. But I think the particular point that's come through from what Sui Yin and Abraham also said earlier is the significance of judicial activity in relation to arbitration. And as we've talked about, curial non-intervention or party autonomy are really guiding themes in Singapore in relation to judicial decision-making. And I've heard many people say when we talk about the impact of virtual conduct of arbitration proceedings, that actually these days the only thing that's relevant in relation to the seat is the oversight of the local courts. And because you probably won't go to the place, you probably don't need the restaurants near Maxwell Chambers, et cetera, et cetera. But the question of how the judiciary handle their oversight of arbitral proceedings is probably the most important. And I don't see any evidence that there's an authoritarian government approach from the judiciary to that process. So I wouldn't think, even if one were to accept the beginning premise, that really detracts from the attractiveness of Singapore as a seat.
No, thanks, Julita. And of course, it comes back to this point about perception as well. And what's interesting is obviously I think there is a recognition that there may be some concern in the context of Hong Kong. But of course, Singapore does have a very different political environment to that in other countries, and yet it doesn't seem to be having the same effect. Opportunity to see how we're doing on the poll. So on the question, most popular arbitral seats apart from London, at the moment, Singapore and Paris are neck and neck on 42%. But I would say that there's only 12 votes so far. So I would encourage other people to keep voting because otherwise we're only doing slightly better than cats choosing cat food at the moment. So please keep the votes coming in. And let's move on to Darius now. Darius, in the context of where arbitrations are seated, here's your question. What should young arbitration practitioners, barristers, and solicitors take into account or take into consideration when deciding how and maybe even where they would want to develop their practice?
Yeah, in my allocated time, I'm just going to focus on 3 key points. The first will be geographical trends. The second will be industry trends, and the last will be comparative law. On geographical trends, we've heard the various panelists talk about India, we've heard about China as well. But when you go behind the buzzwords and you look at what the data says, the message is actually crystal clear. In the SIAC's annual reports for 2019-2020, you see India forging right ahead as the top foreign users. It's not even close. In 2019, the cases involving India was 4 times that of China. In 2019, the cases involving India was 3 times that of China. So India is way up there. This is consistent with the ICC experience. According to the 2019 Icc Statistics, in the list of most frequent nationalities, India jumped from 15 to 2nd, and China jumped from 11 to the 5th, right? With over half of the cases involving Indian parties being administered out of Singapore. So it's almost as though one can draw a line and divide Asia into 2, right? China-related disputes in North Asia, Hong Kong will play an important role, at least in the short term, in my view. Whereas Singapore's growth, my suggestion is that it's deeply intertwined with India. And the message for younger practitioners aspiring to ride on this growth is therefore to develop a reputation for having good insights into either or both jurisdictions. I acknowledge it's not an easy task. Both are massive countries, complex regulatory environments, but at least insofar as India is concerned, the working language is English and therefore will be relatively more accessible. The next point I wanted to flag was industry trends. And again, looking scientifically at the data, what the data tells us, the data from HKIAC and SIAC suggests that the top performing industry sector for both 2018-2019 is international trade. Now, this is not a call for all of us to put all our eggs in one basket, but international trade ties in with China's maritime Silk Road. And in that connection, given the massive development and infrastructure projects required as Asian jurisdictions grow, one would expect engineering and projects to be a key area of growth. This is borne out in ICC's 2019 statistics, construction and energy disputes in total account for 40% of ICC's overall caseload. My last point is an easy one, which is comparative law. And when I was looking through the reports of ICC, HKIAC, and SIAC, I found a common point, which is that the governing law of most arbitrations seem to be based on the common law system, English law, Singapore law, Hong Kong law. But Asia comprises predominantly civil law jurisdictions, and business deals in Asia frequently involve civil law jurisdictions. And in my own experience, it is very common to have to instruct local counsel on points of local law. Even though the governing law of the contract may be a common law system, we would have to instruct local counsel, and therefore having an understanding of how civil law works would come in very handy. I'm going to hand the time back over to you, Guy.
Thank you, Darius. That's very helpful. So let's just pick up that last point on common law versus civil law. I think Darius gives a good aspect to that, which is actually practitioners need to have some familiarity with both. But for arbitration seated in Singapore, are you seeing that actually it is predominantly common law, applicable law, or is it a mix? And I'm going to also give Philippa the opportunity to comment on this as well, because I suspect that in England, in London in particular, it would be very unusual for there to be a civil law applicable law to an arbitration. Not completely unheard of, but quite unusual. So maybe let's hear from either maybe Abraham or Swee Yen on the preferences on applicable law in Singapore.
So let me just say this. I think the dichotomy between common law and civil law sort of falls away when you consider the fact that the choice of governing law is typically a neutral law that two parties of different nationalities and cross-border scenario can ascribe to. And the reality, when you think of it in that sense, is that there are not very many alternatives in civil law that you can count on if you're looking for a neutral alternative. So that, I think, is the first point. So the mere fact that we've got a lot of civil law jurisdictions in Asia, to my mind, is beside the point, because it doesn't answer the question of, well, what are the options available? Secondly, I just wanted to emphasize that, in Singapore, and this may come as an interesting point to some of you, way back in 2006, I was part of an initiative led, believe it or not, by the Singapore judiciary to promote the development and use of Singapore law in cross-border contracts for 3 jurisdictions: China, India, and Indonesia. We were only concerned about these 3 jurisdictions. We formed groups, small armies of lawyers who will be going to these jurisdictions to evangelize the cause of Singapore law. And it's Singapore law as opposed to Singapore as a seat or SIAC as an institution, just Singapore law per se. And the mantra was Singapore law as an alternative to English law or New York law. And, you want to keep disputes in Asia within Asia, right? And that's something that we did very intentionally in 2006. And now, like after 15 years, and I think Swee Yen and Darius and Jelita would be able to confirm this, there's an increasing number of cross-border contracts where Singapore law is being stipulated. And of course, it's a matter of small pride for me to see that the efforts that we had put in 15 years ago is now coming to fruition.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Philippa, but in fact, just because I'm conscious of time and we may want to have a bit more time to pick up some other questions at the end. Philippa, by all means, give your observation on that last question, but why don't you first deal with your question, which is, of course, the very neutral and balanced way to wrap this all up, which is what London and Singapore can learn from each other. And I'm going to be slightly presumptuous in the question here, to maintain their positions as top-ranked seats.
Well, thank you, Guy, and thank you to everybody, because I have to say, following 4, passionate, committed speakers from a jurisdiction that is forging ahead, is potentially a bit of a hard sell. But let me give my best shot. I think, one of the things that we've just talked about is the common law and the importance of the common law as a factor. And I think also you can't underestimate the importance of the English language as a real factor in drawing business and therefore drawing contracts and choices of law and jurisdiction. And so I think, that's something that we're not going to lose. But I think complacency has always been the enemy. And I think for London, in particular, I think there is less of that nimbleness which Singapore has demonstrated so ably, and which my co-panelists have talked about so enthusiastically. Abraham's comment about the speed of legislative action in Singapore is really well made. I mean, I recall last year, I think Singapore was the first jurisdiction to introduce legislation to deal with the impact of the pandemic within about 6 weeks. There were proper emergency legislative powers in place to protect business. And I think things like that are really, impressive. I was just looking at the fact that the Law Commission Guy, as you mentioned, has been looking at the potential revisions to the Arbitration Act of 1996, and that was a project that was launched in December 2017. And I don't think it does London any credit at all that we're still thinking about it. So I do think, there's real scope for learning from the nimbleness that Singapore has demonstrated and the innovative approaches that Singapore has taken. I do think there's a piece around regionalisation. I think, especially in a post-COVID environment, I think, parties will, move more to sort of regional hubs for arbitration hearings and cases. I think, as much as in Singapore, you're looking at, hearing cases in English and under, common law rules that aren't necessarily Singapore law, although obviously Singapore law is starting to really, gain traction. I can see that as between, say, London, Paris, and the seats in Switzerland, which are the sort of the European leading seats, I think London has the opportunity to really stay out in front because of the popularity of the common law worldwide. Now, I know our civil law colleagues will tell us that actually civil law is much better, much more predictable, much more effective. But I think the reality is that the language of business and the experience in business is very often that the common law is preferred. I wanted to say a few words about the commercial court and the role that the courts play in England, because I know we've talked about the sort of non-interventionist policy to a certain extent of the Singapore courts. I think the English courts almost have turned that on its head. And so, while there was a few years ago this very big tension between the courts and arbitration when the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Thomas, gave this speech sort of saying that arbitration was destroying the development of the commercial law because all of these developments were taking place behind closed doors. I think what's really interesting is Mrs. Justice Cockrell, who's the current head of the commercial court in London, gave a speech at the Dispute Resolution Forum about 10 days ago. And she was talking about the work that the commercial court is doing to support and preserve London as a preferred jurisdiction for both litigation and arbitration, including upholding clauses and preserving the rights of parties to proceed in their preferred jurisdictions. And I think there is a benefit in that, and I think parties really welcome the idea that the courts will step in and protect them in those circumstances. And I'm not saying Singapore doesn't. That's not. I mean, Suen very clearly made the point that they do. But I think London going on the front foot to say, we as the courts will protect parties, I think is a really important thing for London in the future. And then there are a few things around development of the pipeline, young practitioners coming through. There's a really active approach to that in London. And I think, feeding that pipeline, bringing through the next generation is incredibly important. And that's something that I think in London is very well supported and very well directed. I think there's also a piece around the commitment to eco-friendly arbitration. I mean, the Green Arbitration Pledge was launched by, a practitioner here. We're looking at a situation where in the post-COVID environment where we've been forced to be eco-friendly for the last 15, 16 months because we can't get on planes and go places. I think there is There are great facilities in London, both for virtual and hybrid hearings. I think, the point that Jalita made around time zones is really important as well, because if we're looking at, transatlantic, trans-Pacific deals, finding a suitable seat for a hearing day that actually works for everybody can be really challenging. I'm chair in a Singapore seated arbitration at the moment, where one of my co-arbitrators is in Canada and one is in Hong Kong, and finding a time to have a meeting is really quite challenging. It's been dawn a few times here when I've been doing those hearings. And then finally, there's the wildcard point, which is what happens if, as was predicted last week on the back of the announcement that the UK was doing a trade deal with Australia, what happens if the UK joins the TPP? Because that, I think, might swing the balance of business and business interest into Asia Pacific, which I think actually might bring Singapore and London into a much bigger conflict about where is the preferred seat for the resolution of those disputes. Because if UK business is looking to Asia and looking to the Asia Pacific in the future, then how attractive does London look to those parties? So we've got a lot of work to do to maintain that position, but I think there's great will and there's great support for it. So I think it will be achievable.
Thanks very much, Philippa. Gosh, there's so much that we could debate in all of that. Unfortunately, we have 4 minutes left. And I do want to give the results of the polls, because we're now up to a heady 17 votes against each of them. So first of all, 82% of people were not surprised that Singapore was named alongside London as the most preferred arbitral seat. So that's very good. What is interesting is that there is a clear majority on the second question, which is the factors most important for choosing an arbitral seat. And that is 82% of the respondents chose formal legal infrastructure, e.g. arbitration law, supportive courts, etc., as the most popular reason, followed by the law governing the substance of the dispute, and then convenience, and no responses for any of the other questions. And then finally, on the poll, Singapore has just nudged ahead of Paris with 47% of the votes, and Paris on 51%. Interestingly, Hong Kong and Geneva come in joint third, but with only 6% of the votes between them. So quite a clear difference there. In fairness, someone has commented that may have something to do with people who self-selected to join this webinar, who may have a particular preference in one of those particular venues. But I do want to go back and ask the panel a question about infrastructure as well, because one topic that we haven't picked up, and we only have 3 minutes to deal with it, is not just the availability of brilliant lawyers and arbitrators, but also experts, because what we know in international arbitration is experts play quite a critical role. And I think, therefore, a question that is relevant and probably asked less is, where are the experts that you want for international arbitration? Where are they based? Where are they coming from? So again, perhaps to our Singapore colleagues first, an interesting question as to when you're sourcing your experts, where do you look? Do you look in Singapore? Do you look more widely? And what are the ranges of that question, of that? Maybe Jalita can go first.
I was going to say, nowadays, absolutely anywhere in the world, guys. So I'm much more interested in the expertise itself and the quality of the expert than anything to do with locality. Experts these days are so user-friendly themselves. I think there's been a huge improvement actually in the accessibility of experts and their willingness to be fully engaged in the process, whatever it requires, hot tubbing and PowerPoints and digital bundles and whatever. And that has been an excellent development as far as being counsel is concerned. But yeah, so I'm much more focused on the quality and the capability of the expert than where they are located these days. Abraham, you've got the same experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, nothing you want to, sorry, Abraham, go.
No, I was just going to echo what Jalita said. I think the question of experts is a bit of a non-issue as far as the choice of seat and what have you is concerned, because they're so readily available.
And I think that highlights actually a point which is demonstrated by this event, which is that this event simply wouldn't have been possible if we were trying to do it physically, because it would not have been we would not have been able to bring everybody together physically to do this. And this is, I think, one of the highlights of actually the point as to whether the seat ultimately is going to matter that much. So the parties may choose a seat of arbitration, but rarely set foot in the venue, in the forum. Certainly in the last Singapore seated arbitration I was involved in, we actually conducted the evidential hearing in Paris. And that was done largely on the basis of convenience for the parties and counsel. We have run out of time, but can I thank all of our speakers very much for a very interactive, very engaging session. Can I thank all of you who've participated in the poll and in the questions. Thank you very much for all of your presentations. Can I thank ICC UK for hosting this? And again, speakers, thank you very much for your participation. Very much appreciated. Natalie.
Thank you, Guy, and thanks everyone. It's been a great session. Again, it will be made available online on Swapcard straight afterwards. So if you do want to watch it again, you can do so by visiting the programme. Thanks ever so much, and we'll see you again later for the ICC Brazil session this afternoon. Take care. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.